Top of the evening, everybody. Hello, good, happy Sunday. Hope everyone is doing as wonderful as you could possibly be doing. In all seriousness, as wonderful as you can possibly be doing, we hope that you're doing that. And we hope that that means your highest level of mental, physical, and spiritual health is being maintained, you all, at all times. And we are so thankful that you have made the decision to join us, hopefully for this next hour, when we talk about this critical topic of the manipulation of Malcolm X's assassination. So thank you all sincerely for joining us. We, as always, want to start by giving sincere honor, praise, and respect to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. And when we say that, we're talking about the real caretakers of these lands from Alaska down to Chile, meaning the indigenous people, American Indians, Chicanos, Mexicanos, however they choose to identify themselves. They are the rightful caretakers of this land, and they are fighting for their land back, you all. This land belongs to them, and they have every right to it. And we stand in 100% solidarity with them achieving their self-determination and their lands back. And along with that, of course, we give honor and respect to our African ancestors who are the very reason that we breathe and exist today. They were the ones who endured the master slave whip. They're the ones who endured the oppression against us, fought vigorously for our self-determination and for our dignity, and we honor them from the eastern shores of the Indian Ocean in Africa all the way out to the western shores of the Pacific Ocean of the Western Hemisphere. Our people have fought for us over the last 528 years. And I don't know about you, but I'm honored to be the product of that proud legacy. And so again, glad to have you all with us for this critical topic today, the manipulation of Malcolm X's assassination. A lot of talk about who killed Malcolm X. There was the documentary last year by that title, and we'll spend a little time talking about who, but what we really want to spend this hour doing is explaining to you the things that Malcolm was doing that we believe set him up for murder in the first place. We don't, there's a plethora of evidence that the US government was behind it. And we'll talk about that, the role of people in the Nation of Islam in carrying out that, because you cannot sweep that under the rug, because if we don't learn from that, then we'll make the same errors again. And I understand, supporters of Minister Farrakhan and people, they don't want to talk about it, but that's not prudent. That's not a good strategy in terms of us understanding how to prevent ourselves from making the same critical errors again. So we will talk about it. If you've come here before, we are not ever shying away from truth. Our focus is not to say things that won't offend people. Our focus is to say things that need to be said that make us stronger in our fight for justice. So we're glad you're joining us today, and we'll just go through our quick introductions, and we will talk in a moment about our topic. So I'm a Jamu, longtime organizer for the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I've done work for the party on 3 continents, primarily in Africa, but some in Europe, some in the Caribbean, and some here in the United Snakes of America. Joining me, I have my amazing and outstanding daughter, Shakura, who grew up in the All African People's Revolutionary Party's Young Pioneer Institute and has, as a result, been in this organization her entire life. And she is doing her work, her activist work, where she is very positive work, very essential work, extremely proud of her. She and I do this every week. We've done it for pretty much a year now. We don't make dance videos together. We don't make videos cussing each other out. If we did, a lot of y'all would be making that viral. But instead, we do political education every week, and we make contributions towards organizing our people for justice. So make that viral. And then going back to the All African People's Revolutionary Party, our work is focused around achieving Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa, one unified socialist Africa. And as Kwame Nkrumah, our founder, stated in his classic book, Class Struggle in Africa, until Africa is free, no Black person anywhere on earth will be free. And we believe that 100%. The book on your right there, the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, was written by Nkrumah in 1968 to provide the strategy for how we would achieve Pan-Africanism, one unified socialist Africa. And in this book, he talked about the need for Pan-African formations on the ground in Africa to unite. And you see there logos of organizations in Africa throughout the continent who agree that one unified socialist Africa is our objective. And they're fighting to do that. And these organizations are hundreds of thousands, millions of members each. The Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, PAC, or what you call South Africa, the real name is Azania. That's the name we have for it. And it's our continent, so we can name it whatever we want. South Africa is what the Europeans named it. The PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau, founded by Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau. The Democratic Party of Guinea, the Party of Sekou Touré in Guinea, two different countries. The Azanian People's Organization, again from Azania. Amilcar Cabral Ideological School in Nigeria, West Africa. The Zimbabwe Movement for Pan-African Socialists. I just talked to my comrade brother in that organization yesterday. And we are building with all of those organizations to achieve our objective of one unified socialist Africa. And we have chapters, again, all over the world where we don't, work with these organizations you see here and others like the Pan-African Union of Sierra Leone and others. We have chapters throughout Africa in places like Kenya and Tanzania and Ghana, et cetera, and so forth. And we also have relationships with other liberation movements around the world who are fighting for liberation against the same enemies that we're fighting against. The Filipino National Liberation Movement, the Irish Republican Socialist National Liberation Movement, obviously the movement of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, and the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. So this is who we are. This is where we're, the work that we're doing. And we're gonna talk about one of our inspirations, a great son of Africa here, El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, on this day, this 56th commemoration of his brutal assassination. And I'm just honored to be able to share this time with you. If it were not for El Hajj Malik El Shabazz or Malcolm X, I certainly would not be here. I certainly would not be living my life the way I humbly try to do it every day. He has had a tremendous impact on my life, tremendous impact. And I don't just mean that as words. I mean in terms of what I do with my life, how I get through every day, the discipline that I have. And I have my daughter on here with me, so she can tell you if I'm making up fantasies about that. He has had a profound impact on me. And so I think it's important that we understand, what his legacy is and how he's impacted us today. And why, we know who he is 56 years after his assassination. The reason for that is because of the wonderful legacy that he left us. And our objective is to do our absolute humble best to carry on his work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shakura to get us started.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Daddy. I really appreciate that. This is a complete honor because I too have benefited greatly from Brother Malcolm's struggle, and I thank him and his family. I thank his ancestors for allowing him to be in a space where he understood, as you always say, Daddy, that it is important to swim against the stream versus with it, because that's really how you get things to happen, is when you have agitation and when you are going against systems of oppression. So I personally am so excited to talk about Malcolm today. I'm very, very grateful to be here. And as my dad said, I like how he said that. I hope that you all are displaying however your best, safest self is. I hope that you are hanging in there and doing that. On February 21st, 1965, 16 bullets ripped into the body of El Haj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm X, ending his life. So much has been written about this man and his legacy. His story has been told and retold. Monuments to his work exist throughout Africa and other parts of the world. If you hadn't read Malcolm's own words, not just the autobiography, which was concluded by Alex Haley, a Republican with suspicious towards Malcolm's politics, you should read one of the 7 or 8 books that published his speeches. We especially recommend, quote, the final speeches of Malcolm X, end quote, not to be confused with, quote, the last speeches of Malcolm X, end quote. So we are encouraging you to find the final speeches book because that was the book actually published the last 11 speeches of Malcolm's life before his assassination. The chronologically chronology, sorry, is critical because those last speeches provide clear insight into where Malcolm's life and politics were headed, which does a lot to confirm the reasons why he was assassinated in the first place. The focus of this next hour will be on examining not Malcolm's autobiography, but some crucial points about his assassination that we believe are constantly missed on all sides of this debate within African activist circles, communities, etc. Next slide, please. To make this argument that we will make today, it is necessary to discuss some objective facts about Malcolm's assassination. Yes, people within the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's former organization, did carry out his assassination. Yes, their efforts to silence our brother were facilitated and orchestrated by the US government, specifically the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Yes, Minister Louis Farrakhan, Muhammad Ali, and many others within the Nation of Islam have vacillated, gone back and forth, and said things all over the spectrum about Malcolm. Yes, Malcolm's funeral was underwritten by Sidney Poitier and his then wife, Juanita, and Dr. Betty Shabazz's, Malcolm's widow, lived with the Poitiers for a time after the assassination. And yes, African revolutionaries in Africa had warned Malcolm while he was in Africa about their intercepted intelligence communications about plans within the US intelligence circles to assassinate Malcolm. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakura. Thank you very much for that foundation. And so now, what we're going to spend the remaining time we have with you today, you all, we're going to talk about the work that Malcolm was engaged in that we believe marked him for murder. Why it happened. What exactly was he doing? And these are things that are not covered in the autobiography. They were not covered in Spike Lee's movie in 1992 with Denzel Washington. They were not discussed at all in that movie. They were not discussed in Rahman Mohammed's Who Killed Malcolm X documentary that a lot of you have looked at last year. They weren't even broached. They weren't even expressed in any of those works. So that's why we think it's so important, because if you look at, if aliens landed on Earth and watched Spike Lee's movie or the documentary, the best you could come away from that with is that, well, he got into this conflict with these people in the Nation of Islam and they shot him and killed him. That's the best you can come away with. I mean, the Spike Lee movie was insanely terrible in the sense that the only reference they made in that movie to the US government having an eye on Malcolm X is they show you the scene where he is in Kemet or Egypt, and he's talking to some local people there, trying to get them to guide him to go see the pyramids. And if you look at the movie again, that's the scene where they show you the CIA people, supposedly, allegedly, you know, that's who they're portrayed to be, watching him, taking pictures of doing that. So if you just watch that film and that's all you know, then the inference is that, oh, okay, well, they're watching him because he wanted to go see the pyramids, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And the reason why it's important to say that is because, you know, we get angry when people say we don't read, but we don't read this comprehensive history. I know that I would be willing to bet that 90% of the people listening right now have not seen the final speeches of Malcolm X. And that's not I'm not throwing shade at you, but that's just a fact. Since we don't study the contributions of people like Malcolm, coming from Malcolm, but we watch these movies and these documentaries, then the dominant source of knowledge that we have about Malcolm is coming from these secondary sources and not the primary sources. So that's the equivalent of your neighbor, somebody coming to your neighbor to ask them about you, and your neighbor saying all kind of things. Maybe 20% of what they say is true. The other 80% is insane and totally untrue. And then that person leaving that and thinking they have a pretty clear analysis of you and your life, you would never accept that. You would never say, okay, well, that's valid. I think that's a valid method of research. So we can't accept that the fact that we allow secondary sources to fuel our understanding of our soldiers for justice. So that's why we are happy you're here, but we also, you know, have to agitate a little and say, you know, we got to do a lot better about doing the necessary work to understand our history and what's happened. We have to do a lot better than we've done. So if we look at some of these pictures here, we can give an analysis starting with that. So the picture on the top left is a meeting that happened in 1960 in Harlem, New York, with Malcolm and Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro. And what happened, if you don't know the history quickly, is what happened is the Cuban Revolution was successful, and the Cuban delegation came to the United Nations to participate in the United Nations General Council meeting in 1960. Now, if you didn't know, the United Nations is located in New York City, here in the United States of America. But because it's the United Nations, it's supposed to be separate territory. It's supposed to be independent territory. It's supposed to be objective. And it's supposed to be that because their stated purpose behind it is that it's a place where everybody in the world can come and participate, supposedly to work through the problems in the world that nations have. But clearly the United Nations, from its inception in the 1940s, has been nothing but a tool of imperialism by the capitalist powers led by the United States of America. So the United States has always used its leverage of having United Nations headquarters on its territory to decide who had access to it. Even though they're not supposed to do that, that's what they always do. So when the Cuban delegation led by Fidel Castro came to New York in 1960 to participate in the United Nations General Assembly, they were refused access to the grounds and to their hotel. And so, you know, the one thing about Fidel Castro that people in this country don't understand is he spent from the early 1950s until his death in 2016, and the Cuban Revolution is still doing it, it'll continue to do it, outthinking, outworking, and completely outdoing anything of any of the 8 or 9 US presidential administrations, just totally outthinking all of those idiots, from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Obama. He outthought each and every one of them, every step of the way. And if you want to look at that history, you should do it. You should look at this story I'm about to tell you. When they came to the United Nations, look at the Playa Girón invasion, or Bay of Pigs, when they defeated US Green Berets that tried to invade Cuba. in 1961, the missiles in October in 1962, where they outsmarted the US and got the US to remove the missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union, all the way up through the Mariel boat lift in 1980, where Jimmy Carter was criticizing the Cuban Revolution, saying that they didn't have democracy and that anybody in Cuba who wanted freedom could come to the US. So Fidel Castro released all the 125,000 criminals in Cuba who wanted to come to the US here. And the movie Scarface is nothing but a fictional depiction of what happened with that. You had all these violent Cuban criminals who were in prison in Cuba because they were violent criminals coming to Florida and becoming violent criminals in Florida. They put it in a movie. It was so obvious. So this is another example all the way up through Elian Gonzalez in 2000. Fidel Castro outsmarted each and every one of them. So when they came here in 1960 and they were refused access to the hotel and the grounds of the United Nations, Castro led the delegation in Central Park and said, well, we'll just pitch tents there. Obviously, that was going to make the U.S. look stupid. So, and they started to do that. But Malcolm, seizing on what he saw as a political opportunity, invited the Cuban delegation. He talked to Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm was in the Nation of Islam at that time. And Elijah Muhammad reluctantly, he didn't want to do it, but he reluctantly agreed to permit Malcolm to engage the Cuban delegation. And Malcolm did that and invited them to the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street in Harlem, New York. And that's where the Cuban delegation stayed. And during that time, Malcolm had this 30 some odd minute meeting with Fidel Castro. Now, the reason why this is so important is because a lot of people try to talk about, well, what happened with Malcolm and the Nation of Islam? And people, you know, the analysis on this out here right now, the dominant analysis is terrible. You know, I see this stuff all the time. People say things, oh, Malcolm wanted to return to the Nation of Islam. Look, you all know how it is with relationships. Pretty much everyone listening to this has had some relationship where it ended and you went back to the person came back to you 2 or 3 times after that. Whether it was to try to reconcile, maybe it was that, maybe it was just to, you know, hang together for the night or whatever it was. That's what happens with human beings. That does not mean because you did that that's the person you want to marry and spend the rest of their life with. And most of the time in that scenario, it doesn't end up happening that way anyway. So we understand this about relationships. Malcolm X did not want to return to the Nation of Islam. We understand. We know he wrote a letter to Elijah Muhammad. This is what happens when you're out on your own and you don't know, you know, what you're going to do, what direction you're going to go. And these are the kind of things people do. But if you look at the hardcore evidence, the fact that he had wanted to have this meeting with these Cuban revolutionaries, the Cuban Revolution had nothing to do with anything Elijah Muhammad was talking about. Elijah Muhammad was not interested in revolution, never was. And I would say their organization still isn't today. And that's not a judgment, it's just a fact. That's not their program. So Malcolm, though, always had a political perspective of our people's conditions. He always had that. So he had the vision that he wanted to engage in political struggle. He never saw our struggle as just a spiritual one or a religious one. He never saw that. And further evidence of that is, I remember the first time that I picked up Kwame Ture when he came here to speak at a couple of the universities here in the mid 1984. I think it was like May of 1984. I picked him up at the airport and took him to where he was going to be staying, and he needed to make some phone calls. And he was making phone calls, and he called Minister Farrakhan because they had discussions they needed to engage in. Because if you recall, if you know the history, that was the time when Jesse Jackson was running for president, and Farrakhan was engaged in that process, and he was relying on Kwame as somewhat of an advisor as to how to proceed with that. And as you know, that whole thing didn't go very well in the end. And I was actually there with Kwame that day when he was telling Minister Farrakhan that it wasn't going to go well. But one of the things because they were disagreeing about that in their phone conversation, one of the things that Minister Farrakhan told Kwame is that he said, brother, you're like Malcolm. You're more of the political mind. I'm a spiritual mind. I look at the struggle through a spiritual lens. You and Malcolm look at it through a political lens. And that's exactly the point I'm making right now about Malcolm, is that he was developing as a political revolutionary, even though he may not have been in an organization that was a political revolutionary organization. That was the progress he was making. So when he, in December 1st, 1963, made those comments about John Kennedy's assassination, the chickens coming home to roost, he knew exactly what he was doing when he said that, y'all. He had explicit instructions. All of the Nation of Islam ministers did. Do not comment. This is a quote from Elijah Muhammad. Do not comment on the death of this man. This nation loved this man. Do not comment. And Elijah Muhammad was afraid that if the nation was perceived as making fun of Kennedy's death, that it could cause people to want to attack Nation of Islam members on the street. So that was his concern. So Malcolm knew exactly what he was doing when he made that comment about the chickens coming home to roost. And that comment was one of the best comments to this day to define imperialism. He talked about how the United States engages in sabotage and manipulation and exploitation all over the world, and you can't expect that to happen without it coming back around on you. So Malcolm understood that because he was evolving as a political revolutionary. And that meeting he had with Fidel Castro in 1960 was not the end of his connection to Cuban revolutionaries, quiet as it's kept. And what I'm telling you right now, I've been able to research by looking at Malcolm's diary, by looking at Kwame Nkrumah, who's in the picture with Fidel Castro on the right, and in the picture with Malcolm X on the bottom left. Kwame Nkrumah's letters from Conakry, looking at some of the writings that have come out of the Cuban Revolution since that time. And so from those, what we've been able to ascertain is that Malcolm maintained relationship with the Cuban revolutionaries. And what that relationship was, we don't know the exact details. But one thing we do know is that Cuba was planning a major international revolutionary summit in the summer of 1965 in Havana, Cuba. And their intention was to have Malcolm X come there and speak. And they wanted Malcolm badly because Malcolm was a voice coming from the beast, from the belly of the beast here, the United Snakes of America, who was anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, developing that analysis and was committed to overthrowing this backward decadent system and had credibility among people in this country and around the world. And the Cubans recognize this. They've always been very good at recognizing the quality of work that's going on, even if the work that was being engaged in was not consistent with their own ideology. The Cubans have never cared about that. They've always only been concerned about linking up with people who were doing genuine work. So that's why it's not hard to understand why Fidel Castro, developing Marxist-Leninist revolutionary, would meet with Malcolm X, who was a member of the Nation of Islam, a religious organization. And it's also not hard to understand why Malcolm X would meet with Fidel Castro. And those ties were bound and they were created to create this relationship that Malcolm unfortunately was not able to live long enough to fulfill and carry out. But they wanted to form a worldwide network of revolutionaries. Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm X, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Nguyen Ao Thac, or who you call Ho Chi Minh. These folks were communicating with each other, you all, and they were trying to build a worldwide network of revolutionaries that were going to be anti-imperialist in their nature. This is what was going on. And again, all you have to do is look at the things that Nkrumah talked about, that Malcolm talked about, that Fidel Castro talked about. Fidel Castro talks about it in his book, In Defense of Socialism. Sekou Touré talks about it. All of this was happening during that time in the early 1960s. And at the same time that Malcolm was building with the Cuban revolutionaries, he was doing his greatest work, which was his revolutionary Pan-African work. And again, this is something that was not even mentioned in Spike Lee's movie, not even mentioned in the documentary Who Killed Malcolm X, not even really discussed. And so as a result, most of us don't even understand any element of that. But what we can tell you about it is this picture on the bottom left, Malcolm and Kwame Nkrumah in 1960 in Harlem, African Liberation Day. And those bonds were being built, you all. And in 1964, most of you, you may not know that much about Kwame Nkrumah, but one thing we can tell you is that when Ghana became independent in March 6, 1957, Nkrumah, on the independence speech that night, called for Africans everywhere on earth to come to Ghana and help make Ghana the base for the Pan-African Revolution. And a lot of people heeded his call from that speech. A lot of people, even if you don't know that much about Nkrumah, a lot of people did respond to that. Maya Angelou, the poet, she went and lived in Accra, Ghana for 5 years in response to Nkrumah's call. W.B. Du Bois, one of the co-founders of the NAACP, and his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, they went to Ghana and became advisors to Nkrumah. George Patmore, the great Pan-African revolutionary who was Joseph Stalin's political secretary, came to Ghana and became an advisor to Nkrumah. All of these folks came there and did that. Louis Armstrong, the trumpeter, went there. And Malcolm X went to Ghana and met with Nkrumah. And we don't know exactly what happened in those meetings, but here's what we do know, is that when Malcolm went to Ghana, he went a couple of times and met with Nkrumah. Nkrumah supplied Malcolm with a driver. He gave him a military escort. He treated him like a diplomat, which at that time, you have to understand, U.S. imperialism, like it is today, was the dominant force. And Nkrumah and U.S. imperialism put tremendous pressure on Kwame Nkrumah not to give any attention to Malcolm X, because Malcolm X was obviously a chief critic of the U.S. government. And so the way geopolitics work, when a government invites someone who's a chief critic of your government as an esteemed guest, that's a slap in the face to your government. And we're talking about the most powerful government on earth. So this is what Nkrumah did. This is what Secretary did. Secretary gave Malcolm X an armed guard in Guinea and a chef to be with him for the time that he was in Guinea. Secretary in the picture on the bottom right with Comrade Fidel Castro. That's what he did. These were slaps in the face to U.S. imperialism. And that's how they took it. And they understood the necessity to do whatever they could to quell the work that Malcolm was doing, because Kwame Nkrumah and Secretary understood that they had to walk this delicate line because they were heads of state. And they understood the powers that U.S. imperialism had, British imperialism, all of them, to undermine their very fragile efforts to build their governments. But Malcolm X, as a private citizen, quote unquote, was not restricted by any of these things. So he could do whatever he wanted. So the analysis that we're presenting to you today is that their discussions with Malcolm were designed to encourage Malcolm to continue to have a revolutionary Pan-African voice and say some of the things that maybe they couldn't necessarily say at the time. And Malcolm certainly did that. And if you look at that book, The Final Speeches of Malcolm X, those last 11 speeches, they're all revolutionary Pan-African speeches, each and every one of them, where he's talking about the need for Africans all over the world to unite, where he's talking about capitalism being a bloodsucker system, where he's talking about, he says, the quote in one speech, everywhere on earth where I see people who are really fighting genuinely for justice, they're embracing socialism as their objective. So Malcolm was doing that. Now, they couldn't publicize that, but if you do the research, it's not very difficult to understand that. Kwame Nkrumah basically says it in his letters from Conakry, Guinea, when he was in Guinea from 68 to 72 until his physical transition. He talks about his dialogue with Malcolm and how he connected Malcolm with Che Guevara, because Che Guevara had come to Ghana and spent time with Kwame Nkrumah, spent 2 weeks there with him. And so all of this was happening behind the scenes to us because we don't study history. But the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, or Criminals in Action, as we call them, and all of the bourgeois US intelligence agencies, they were fully aware of this. And they understood that they needed to make it a priority to do something to stop Malcolm X. They had to do that because they could not have a scenario where all the people around the world were listening to this man who was from this country deriding and criticizing his country. Because you have to understand that even to this day, this is true, but certainly in 1964, the vision of the US around the world was that it was the citadel of freedom and democracy. The US Information Agency and all of the US propaganda mechanisms worked overtime to present that message. And that's why, like, if you come from an immigrant family, that's what they'll tell you. Oh, I came here because it's the citadel of freedom and democracy, because that's the messages they heard when they were trying to get here. And so they could not have somebody with the prestige of Malcolm X going around the world combating that message. And that's exactly what Malcolm did. Because if you read, again, study, you all, if you read John Lewis's autobiography, and you don't have to be a fan of John Lewis. I'm not a fan of John Lewis, but I read his autobiography because I want to be educated about this history. And if you read his autobiography, John Lewis talked about when Secretary invited the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to Guinea. John Lewis talked about how everywhere they went, from somebody who was selling food on the side of the road to the diplomats they met throughout Africa, everybody asked them, as soon as they found out they were an activist group, an African activist group from the United States, everybody wanted to know, what is your position in relationship to Malcolm X? That's not me saying that. That's what John Lewis wrote. Moderate John Lewis. That's what he wrote in his autobiography. What is your position in relationship to Malcolm X? Because, and what John Lewis wrote is people were asking them that because if they had said, well, we don't support Malcolm X, then they would never, the people didn't want to have anything else to do with them. So they had to, just, oh yeah, Malcolm X is a great leader, even though, at that time, John Lewis was not so much a supporter of Malcolm X. He was, John Lewis was a disciple of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But this was, I'm telling you this so that you can understand the heavy weight that Malcolm's work was creating all around the world, not just in this country, but all around the world. And I'm wanting you to understand that work was not just Malcolm as an individual. Malcolm didn't have a job. So how was he able to travel? You got to ask yourself these questions, right? How was he able? He had no job, no income. The Nation of Islam was not, he had left the Nation of Islam. So they weren't paying him. His sister, Ella Collins, paid for some of it, but she could not have afforded with an everyday slave job that she had to all of Malcolm's trade. You got to think about this. So this was a network of revolutionaries that were supporting this work, you all. That's what we're saying to you today, that this is what was happening. And it's no accident that all these people here you see and people you don't see were viciously sabotaged by US imperialism. If they were not out and out murdered, like Malcolm was, like Patrice Lumumba was, like Che Guevara was, then they were victimized by relentless sabotage like the Cuban Revolution was, and like the Democratic Party of Guinea and Guinea was under Secretary. So this is what happened. And this is why Malcolm was so dangerous. And Malcolm founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, a year after Kwame Nkrumah helped found the Organization of African Unity. And we know now, the specter of neocolonialism. So those bodies were not bodies that were going to bring about the Pan-Africanism that we need. That's why Nkrumah wrote the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. But at that time, the point I'm making is that we got to understand, like Malcolm naming his organization that's not a coincidence, y'all. That's because Malcolm saw his work in this country as linked up to the Pan-African work that Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, and all of these African revolutionaries were carrying out on the African continent. And the forces of reaction in this country knew that they could never allow that to happen. They knew that. So this worldwide network was taking place, and Malcolm was operating smack dab in the middle of it, you all. He was smack dab in the middle of it. And this is why it became so dangerous for him in those last 11 months. So, what exactly, Malcolm's going around, like, what was the result of his influence? Like, how did his work manifest itself? Like, what exactly happened? So, if you look at, you talk about this worldwide network of revolutionary Pan-Africanists and other revolutionaries, and Malcolm being, a really clear voice within that network and coming from the belly of the beast, look at the impact that Malcolm had. This is the stuff that this government was looking at regarding Malcolm X. And if most of you don't know about it because all you did was watch these movies and documentaries, and they don't have anything about any of this in there because they're not trying to talk about Malcolm's revolutionary work. They have other agendas that really seem to have nothing to do with our people's liberation and forward progress. So this picture on the top here, you see Malcolm speaking to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Selma, Alabama on February 12th, 1965, just less than 2 weeks before Malcolm was assassinated. And this was the speech where Malcolm reiterated his famous house slave, field slave analysis. But what's important to understand about this is that Malcolm had a debate with Bayard Rustin at Howard University in 1961 that SNCC sponsored, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC was so, even though SNCC was founded in the, religious Christian minister Martin Luther King civil rights movement, SNCC was profoundly impacted by Malcolm's African nationalism. And members of SNCC maintained relationships with Malcolm. Malcolm writes in his diary, if you read it, it's there, that he was in an ice cream shop and he ran into a young Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, who was a student of Howard and one of the people who organized that debate with Bayard Rustin. And they talked about how they should continue to build their relationships. And they did that. And so this speech here, contrary to that backward reactionary Ava DuVernay or whatever her name is, Selma movie, I'm sorry, I don't, French names. I was born with a French name and I gave it back to him because I'm not French. So if you see that as disrespectful, I'm not disrespecting her for her name. I'm disrespecting her for that hit job movie she did on our movement. And in that movie, she had the scene where the Malcolm X character drives up there and the Coretta Scott King character berates the Malcolm X. That never happened, you all. That never happened. And they make it seem in the movie that the event was a Southern Christian Leadership Conference event, which was not true. It was a SNCC event. SNCC invited Malcolm there. Martin Luther King was in jail. You know the story, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Martin Luther King was in jail. So they invited Malcolm there because they wanted to infuse the movement with African nationalism, with militancy. That's what they wanted to do. And they knew the right person to do it was El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. So they invited him there and he spoke to him and he inflamed that SNCC organization. And you cannot tell me that the next year when SNCC advanced away from Martin Luther King and SCLC's Freedom Now slogan to Black Power, that was not firmly influenced by Malcolm X. No question about that. In the Eyes on the Prize series, Kwame Ture and Cleveland Stellers tell you as much. Two of the primary SNCC organizers and the SNCC board, when Kwame defeated John Lewis as chairperson of SNCC, they brought in a militant SNCC board, people like Kwame and Cleve Stellers, his son that, Bakari Stellers is on CNN, a disgrace to the memory of SNCC and the work his dad did, but that's a different discussion. But those folks, Ruby Doris Robinson, may she rest in power, Mukasa Dada, all of the militant Pan-African elements of SNCC, they began to take SNCC in a militant direction. And this fueled the Black Power movement, which produced the Black Panther Party. Huey P. Newton, when he talked about the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party, talked about how his vision for the Black Panther Party for self-defense came from the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was better known as the Black Panther Party in Lowndes County, Alabama, which was a SNCC product, and how all of that, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Lowndes County, Alabama, and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California, all of that was influenced by El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. The Republic of New Africa, they considered Malcolm X, after his death, their theoretical foundation. The Revolutionary Action Movement, they considered Malcolm X their theoretical foundation. This, you all, the US organization, Maulana Karenga, they considered Malcolm X their theological foundation, their philosophical foundation. So all of the organizations that spearheaded the Black Power movement saw Malcolm X as their ideological father. And if you didn't know that, I'm telling you, the forces of US imperialism were 100% clear about that. 100% clear about that. And they understood while Malcolm was alive that they had to put an end to it. The error they made is they thought that by killing Malcolm, they would kill his ideas. And that's because they don't understand what Huey P. Newton said when he said the power of the man's technology will never equal the spirit of the people. These people don't understand that. They think if they just have the bigger guns, they'll win. That's all they understand. But Malcolm clearly had a dominant influence. There's no organizations that came out in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s that are telling you, yeah, we were inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King. Nothing against Dr. King. I think he was a wonderful, principled man who make great contributions. I'm just trying to get you to understand why this government killed Malcolm X. That's what we're trying to do right now, because of his influence. It's not an accident that in the 80s and 90s, there was a period where you couldn't find a hip hop record that didn't have some snippet from El Hajj Malik El Shabazz on it. Public Enemy, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, which is one of the best hip hop albums ever, arguably. I think it is. And the first record on that album, Bring the Noise, Too Black, Too Strong, Too Black, Too Strong. The first thing you hear on that album were Malcolm's words. So none of this is a coincidence, you all. This speaks to the impact of Malcolm X. And don't be confused because they gave him a stamp. That's because they're trying to get out in front, and because they know we don't study, they want to define for you who Malcolm X was and defang him and take the militancy out of it. So that's why we have to study. That's why that's so important. You know, in Edgar Hoover's counterintelligence document, he talks about Malcolm X is the martyr of the Black nationalist movement today. And he talks about Malcolm being a unifying force. So they were not confused about that, you all. They knew what they were doing. They knew they had to get rid of Malcolm. So we said in the title, Malcolm's death was manipulated. So how was it manipulated? Like, what are we talking about? Well, what we mean by that is all these efforts to point to you. You see the picture of Malcolm there, you see Minister Farrakhan on the right, and he was Fruit of Islam. He was security for Malcolm, and he was a mentee of Malcolm X. See, Malcolm was one of the reasons why he came into the Nation of Islam. That's just objective history. And so what they want to frame for you all is this. They want to get you to just focus on, well, what happened? Who was there? And that's important. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of who pulled the trigger, but it's a distraction. It's a distraction from the work that Malcolm was carrying out. It's a distraction designed to stop us from thinking about what exactly happened. And, it's not our intention today. Like, we're not trying to take any responsibility off of Minister Louis Farrakhan. That's something he's going to have to deal with for the rest of his life. And at the Nation of Islam, no matter how much they try, they're going to have to deal with that. They're going to grapple with that. And the reason why is that, you know, Minister Farrakhan has been all back and all over the place around this. One day he's expressing regret for what happened to Malcolm and his role in it. And then the next day he's talking about Malcolm was a traitor that needed to die. And this is, you know, if you study him, he's got a pattern of that. You know, I just read this book written by Malik Zulu Shabazz about Khalid Abdul Muhammad, who, you know, had a similar falling out with Minister Farrakhan like Malcolm had with Elijah Muhammad. And, you know, Minister Farrakhan graciously, according to Malik Shabazz, graciously sent money to help pay for the burial of Khalid Abdul Muhammad. I know that Erykah Badu paid a significant portion of that as well. And did that. And then a week later, this is documented, you can go on YouTube and see this, he gives a lecture where he's denouncing Khalid. So this is, you know, this is something that he does for whatever his own reasons of doing it. He goes back and forth. He's got to deal with that. He has to, you know, that's something that's going to hound him. And I think all he would have to do for me is just say, look, we messed up. We got manipulated and we ended up being pawns, being used by our enemies against our brother. If he said that, I think it will be fine. But as long as that doesn't happen, I think that there will always be a large number of African people who will have issues. And I'm just putting that out there because I hope that he does do that at some point and leave it alone at that. But they want us to be focused on that and just focus on that and not focus on the larger issue, which is the work that Malcolm was doing and why that work needs to continue. And also they want us to focus on this concept that they want to submit this subtle idea in our mind that if you engage in militant struggle, you'll be killed and that'll be the end of it. You know, because that's been the message. That's the message. That's what you got, whether you know it or not, out of Spike Lee's movies, because that's where it ends. It ends when he gets killed. So then that's the message. That's what you got off the documentary. And the documentary was so pitiful that this clown makes the whole thing about the fact that this clown that clearly played a role in Malcolm X's assassination was walking around New York up until just a couple of years ago, and that he died and nothing happened to him before he died. And this guy was, you know, on this mission to get this guy convicted. And okay, fine. But whether you got him convicted or not, he's dead, whatever, who cares? The point is, what is the significance of Malcolm's work in his life? That's the significance of it. 100 years from now, nobody's going to be caring about whether that guy went to prison for killing him or not. But Malcolm's political legacy will move and live on because of his contribution to our forward progress. So we have to make sure we're understanding what that was. That is not happening. And also, you know, we have to understand, like, a lot of this white noise that's happening now is about fomenting a lot of this stuff is instigated by FBI, CIA still to this day to foment distrust among the African community. In those days, it was distrust between Malcolm's OAAU forces and the Nation of Islam. Today, it might be distrust between the Nation of Islam and folks who followed Khalid Muhammad. You know, who knows? But that's what they're doing. And so, you know, there have been historically many instances of that. You know, we could talk about the killing of Clarence 13X, or Father Allah, as they call him, the alleged founder of the 5% Nation of Islam, the Hanafi Muslims in New Jersey. All of this stuff is a reflection. And if you don't know about those things, you gotta do the research. But all of this stuff is a reflection of what I'm talking to you all about. We have to understand the importance of not letting our enemies shape our history for us. And understanding that, you know, if we want to have an issue with the Nation of Islam, we should be experts on what the Nation of Islam is about. And if we're that, then we understand that it doesn't benefit us to turn our people against any organization. That what we need to do instead is try to figure out how to engage in building relationships so that we can engage in the proper political education and do that collectively. And that will do more than anything else to stop all the negative and reactionary interactions that we have with each other that keep us from moving forward. And then also, you know, again, refocus. Malcolm's life was about achieving true liberation for the African masses. And that can only happen when we achieve Pan-Africanism. And that was Malcolm's work. And the reason why I get so angry at these movies and documentaries and all these books coming out is that they deflect from that. And you see that, and you don't, you know, study Malcolm's words himself. You're not in organization, so you don't understand how Malcolm was moving and working. Then you miss the whole point of the relevance of people like Malcolm X, which was the work that he was engaged in. Because you can't say you love somebody unless you carry on their work. That's the only way you can say, that's the only way you can demonstrate that you believe in what they were doing, is by carrying on their work. That's how you do that. So if you, well, they got him, we don't have no more leaders anymore, because that's how a lot of you talk. We don't have any more leaders anymore. That's, you're doing exactly, you're interpreting this exactly how our enemies want you to interpret it. If you've ever uttered something like that, our problems, we don't have any more leaders, because that's what they want you to think, that, well, they killed Malcolm, they killed Martin, they killed whoever, Patrice Lumumba, so there's nothing you can do. So just sit here and be oppressed and just live with that. Hopefully you can get a car out of the deal, maybe even a house, maybe even a fifth wheel, a camper or something. But that's the best you're ever going to be able to do, is just be a comfortable slave. So don't get involved in that struggle. Don't do that, because that's going to get you killed. You missed the whole point of what Malcolm X's life represented. You missed the whole point, you all. And we got to stop missing it. Malcolm was engaged in critical work, and that work is still going on. And we need people to be a part of that work. That's the point. So we want to close by just saying that, again, it's important you join some organization. Please join an organization working for justice. Any organization, join one. Malcolm left the Nation of Islam. He started 2 organizations, Muslim Mosque Incorporated and Organization of Afro-American Unity. So you got to be in an organization. You can't do it by yourself. You know, I understand, you know, you don't, you know, it's uncomfortable. You don't have time, but somebody sacrificed, and they were way more comfortable than you ever can be, than I ever can be. And they sacrificed organizationally. They lost their lives. Like, I was at some church years ago, and this ministry, you can't pay the price that Jesus paid. And I rose up and said, Malcolm paid the price. What are you talking about? Just because you're accounting, they made me leave. But these people pay the price for us. So we can't just, well, I don't want to be uncomfortable. Then you're a sellout to humanity. So join an organization, you all. You decide which one. We're not going to tell you which one. We just tell you got to join one. You got to stop talking about it. Shut your mouth. Like, people talk too damn much. Join an organization and stop talking about what needs to happen. Why do I want to hear you talk about it and you don't even believe enough in what you're saying to be involved in a process to make it happen? So I don't want to hear that. You know, you don't think we can tell? We're doing work. We can tell when you just running your mouth. Stop doing that. You look like a fool. Get in an organization and get with some people and build something. That's how you respect Malcolm. Do that. And if you want to join the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we would love for you to come to aaprp-intl.org right there on your screen and inquire, and we will follow up with you so that you can join us. And I have my site, John Umi's Truth Challenge, abetterworld.me. You can go there. You can send me a message, cussing me out. You can find out, you know, all the work that's going on, and you can do that. And then I'm also one of the humble editors for hoodcommunist.org, outstanding site. If you have not seen it, you need to go there as soon as you get through here. Outstanding articles on the African Revolution and worldwide revolution. There's an outstanding article this week we have on African women identifying people in feminism. You should really check that out, you all. It's outstanding. And next Sunday, we're gonna do, actually the title is gonna be African Liberation Month, which was our Hood Communist theme, why we should have that and not Black History Month. And then I just wanna also ask you to go and buy my I just completed this manifesto, a guide for organizing defense against white supremacist and patriarchal White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. It's only $8 for a paperback copy. It's 70 pages. And what it is, you all, is it's a guide for how to organize neighborhoods on a block by block basis to empower these neighborhoods to work independently for freedom and liberation, while linking that work to our international struggle for one unified socialist Africa, or international struggle for solidarity and justice for humanity. So go do that, please. You can go on to betterworld.me to get information about how to get that book. Again, it's only $8. It talks about some really concrete methods of organizing people, how you go in neighborhoods and organize, democratic decision-making tools, how to organize work study books for study and reading. All of those things are in there, and step by step how to do it. So I think you'll really be inspired for it. So go get your copy of it today. People are buying it. As you know, we use the proceeds to finance our revolutionary work. So that's what we're going to continue to do. We hope you can join us next week, African Liberation Month, not Black History Month. APRP-INTL.org, abetterworld.me, hoodcommunist.org. Go to abetterworld.me for a guide for organizing defense against white supremacists, patriarchal, and fascist violence. We are going to destroy capitalism. We're going to destroy imperialism. We're going to smash patriarchy. We're going to destroy homophobia and white supremacy. And we're going to create a world where human beings can reach their full potential and live in peace and harmony for the rest of human existence, forward ever, backwards never. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.